The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun.
Well, what if that guy is actually a woman? And what if that woman is trying to defend herself against a violent partner? As the Bureau of Justice Statistics notes, quote, females made up 70% of victims killed by an intimate partner in 2007, a proportion that has changed very little since 1993. So how likely is it that a woman will be found justified if she invokes stand your ground? And what role does race play? The case of Marissa Alexander has a lot to tell us about the answer to that question. The Jacksonville, Florida mother faces up to 60 years in prison for firing a warning shot into the wall during a violent incident with her husband. Now, no one was injured. And as Think Progress notes, Alexander's husband had already been arrested 2 times before on misdemeanor battery charges against other women. Alexander was initially convicted for aggravated assault, which carries a 20-year sentence. The conviction was later overturned, and Alexander was granted a retrial. But Florida State Prosecutor Angela Corey is continuing to pursue what many feel are excessive charges for a nonviolent offense. Corey is now seeking to triple Alexander's sentence from 20 years to 60. 60 years for firing a shot into the wall in defense against her abusive husband. It's a scenario that we know ends far too many times with the woman as the dead victim. And yet, as my colleague Erin Carmone reported this week, the reason Corey has given for the additional time is she believes Alexander was angry and not fearful when she fired that shot. Well, joining me now to discuss the case of Marissa Alexander and the disproportionate impact stand your ground justifications have are MSNBC.com, Erin Carmone, and Sirius XM radio host Joe Madison, whose show airs weekdays at 6 a.m. Eastern. Thanks to you both for joining me.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Karen.
So I want to talk about the specifics of Marissa Alexander's case in a minute, but Erin, I want to start with you because I want to put this in a broader context. You talk about in your piece, in general, how much harder it is for women to convince a jury that she was justified when she invokes stand your ground. Talk about that.
Well, I mean, in any kind of self-defense scenario, you have to say that you have a reasonable belief that you are under threat. In a domestic violence situation, the threat is kind of ongoing. It's every day. And many women feel like they cannot leave abusive relationships. So occasionally that means that, and often, that means that a jury or a judge or a prosecutor will not find her to be credible. Why didn't you leave before?
Right.
And we have a tendency to kind of overestimate the resources that people have when they leave abusive relationships, and also the safety that even if they do leave, that they will somehow still be safe from their abuser.
Well, and aren't there also some challenges with stand your ground? Because initially came from the Castle Doctrine, which was much more of a patriarchal man defending his home. And what you're talking about, if you're a woman standing your ground in your own home, you don't have any place to retreat, right? You've already retreated to your home. So doesn't that add to the challenge?
Right. I mean, the irony is when people talk about the Castle Doctrine, it's like you're defending your home and all the aggressors are outside. Well, sometimes the aggressors are coming from inside the house. Sometimes you're not safe in your own home, and that complicates things. There's a slightly higher burden if you don't have a protection order against the person living in the house with you. Then you have to prove even more reasonable suspicion or reasonable fear that you were under attack.
So, Joe, for this piece, we worked with the Urban Institute to compile data, and it showed the racial disparities among women when it comes to justifiable homicide. And we've got a graphic up here. So when you have a white offender and a white shooter and a black victim, 13.5% of the time the killer is found justified. And I just want to focus in on when you have an African-American shooting an African-American, 5.7% of the time would that woman be found justified. And that goes down if it's a black woman and a white victim, and then even lower if it's a white victim and a white shooter. But I think the point is pretty clear here that women of color tend to disproportionately have trauma utilizing justifiable homicide.
Yes, and it shows that the issue transcends gender. because those are almost parallel, not necessarily exact numbers, with African American men. So the issue is whether you're a black man or a black woman, if there's a certain stereotype, a certain attitude towards African Americans in this country who commit crimes versus whites who commit crimes. You know, we hear it in our language. For example, whenever there's a shooting of black man against a black man or black woman against a black woman, it's always black on black crime. But you never hear anyone say white on white crime. The reality is crime, no matter what the color. And something else I want to add is that there's this timorous attitude, disposition that women are supposed to have. They're supposed to be more timid. When it comes to defending themselves. And men, of course, are supposed to be aggressive when defending themselves.
And you know, Joe, to that point, I mean, I guess part of what really angered me about Angela Corey, there's a lot that I don't like about the way she's pursued many of these cases, but for her to suggest that it's inappropriate for Marissa Alexander to be angry and not scared, and as Aaron and I were just talking about, you could be both. I mean, it seemed like a very appropriate response to be both angry and fearful and genuinely be trying to stand your ground and protect your children. It made me think that this is the stereotype of the angry black woman, and that therefore it was not okay for her to be angry in that instance.
And that's what I mean by this timorous disposition. You have to be timid. If not, then you're out of control, that type of thing. So, but again, let's go back to the very basic problem with this. It's a bad law in Florida. It's a bad law wherever that law exists, no matter whether it is directed at blacks, whites. It's just a bad law.
Yeah, it is. Aaron, speaking of Corey, her critics have said that she's obsessed with overcharging. I think that's a little bit fair. And she has sent more people to death row than any other prosecutor in Florida. And I think we have a graphic that shows she has put more people in death row than other Florida state attorneys. 66% of death row inmates in Corey's district are black, while they make up just 16% of the state population. What is going on with Angela Corey?
I mean, you know, it's interesting. Those Urban Institute numbers that we came up with that show that you're 3 times more likely to be found justified if you're a woman who killed a black man, a white woman who killed a black man. I think it goes to the same point, which is to say that systemically and individual attitudes, we have much more, in general, Americans have a much more facility in imagining the criminality and the lack of innocence of a black man. So unfortunately, you have this intersection of race and gender there, but the one thing you have in common is that the result is likely to go against a black man.
And you know, she just sent out, you may find this on the internet, she just sent out images. It was interesting, a list of things that she said was misrepresentation of what really happened. But then she sent photographs of showing Marissa looking, disheveled.
It's like a wanted poster.
Exactly. And said,
I'm sure she wasn't trying to sway any juries or anything. I wanted to bring this issue up because, as you know, both Aaron and Joe, last week I decided, hey, let's start this conversation talking about women and talking about issues and how they disproportionately affect women of color. And Joe, I completely agree with you that stand your ground is a terrible law, but I do think it's important that we also acknowledge, and I thought Aaron's piece did it was important work to show the disproportionate impact that it's having on women, and particularly women of color, and that's something we need to pay attention to and focus on.
Absolutely.
And I want to thank you both for joining me, Aaron Carmone and Joe Madison, and be sure to catch the Joe Madison Show on Sirius XM Radio every weekday morning at 6 a.m. Eastern.